Today, we're delighted to welcome Michael Scott to the Apex interview series. He's the founder of the famous 96 Club and also the Guild of Specialist Engineers. Last year was the 40th anniversary of the 96 Club, so we're going to talk a bit about the origins of the fantastic club, along with their plans for the future. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Let's begin. So, first question. Do you mind telling us a bit about how your passion for the automotive world began?
So, the reason I've been a nutcase for the motor car and motor racing is that my father was an apprentice engineer with AEC, the bus makers, and he then, when he graduated, he set up Specialoid Pistons, and Specialoid Pistons were in all the cars. They were in the Bentleys and the Rolls Royces, they were in the tanks, they were in the aircraft. And as a result, he had a sort of insight into the engineering world during the war. And as a result of that, we all got involved with his passion, which was cars. And of course, he was Jack the Lad when he was a 25-year-old. He had a 4.5-litre Bentley and was a car enthusiast himself. After the war, just before the war, he also had a business which was called Atalanta Cars. And not many of you will have heard of the Atalanta, but it was an amazingly advanced sports car in 1936-37. It had independent suspension all round, and it was the first car to have an American V8 installed in it. And so consequently, he was a dedicated car man. After the war, he was a sales director at Specialoid Pistons still, and they said you can't have two businesses at the same time. So he gave up Atalanta Cars and stuck with Specialoid. Specialoid then went bust, believe it or not, and so he should have stayed with Atalanta. And Atalanta, sadly, it's very few. They only made about 30 of them. But it was a great car. So everything to do with my father was classic engineering. So consequently, when I was a kid, he obviously kept in touch with all the motor manufacturers and the engineers, and that is how I met W.O. Bentley, and we used to go for tea at his home in Shamley Green, sort of every summer, and then, of course, I went to his funeral, and I had until last year the order of service, and I kept it in my copy of the W.O. Bentley story for all those years. And last year I gave it to Sir Michael Cudery for his museum in his own private collection, because I thought it was a wonderful place for it to reside. So that's how I met a new W.O. With Father, we went to Goodwood to the first meeting after the war, and I remember it so well. An HRG turned over in front of us, and we saw the guy leap into the air and enter the back of the seat of the car, and he disappeared under the four-seater in the back. And to everyone's astonishment and delight, they pulled the car up onto his wheels, and he climbs out. So that was I always wanted to be a racing driver after that for some reason. We went to the Silverstone Grand Prix when the V16 BRM started on the pole position and didn't do a lap. So everything I did was around motorsport and motor engineering. And of course, I was an apprentice engineer. I was very fortunate because I inherited a nice lump sum of money when I was 21. and that enabled me to buy my car, which I've still got, which is the Lancia Astura, and that is another story in itself. And I'm a bit concerned that I'm taking a long time to answer a perfectly simple question, but as a result of my enthusiasm for engineering, I met Maurice Smith, who was the editor of Autocar, and Maurice was one of the Pathfinder pilots. He got the DFC bombing Germany, and he was a great friend of mine because I was a competitive squash player. I played in the amateur squash championship every year, and Maurice was another keen squash player. And as a result, he used to go to Le Mans every year with the autocar, and I tagged along with him. And as a result, I met Steady Barker. And Steady Barker was the president of the VSCC and a very well-known motoring journalist who actually was the road test editor of Autocar. And as a result of meeting him, I became a very close friend, and I would spend my weekends with him, helping him restore his cars. His cars were probably the most exciting cars collection you can imagine, because he a huge enthusiast and an ex-RAF engineer who'd worked on all the Spitfires throughout the war. So Steady had a great talent for engineering, and one of the most remarkable things that I did with him was we went and collected a 1914 Grand Prix Napier from Odium in Sussex in bits. It had been taken to bits by the owner in 1921, and we collected the Napier. And 5 years later, we actually drove the car, having completely rebuilt it, and that's a very famous car. Going on from there, Steady had in the back of the workshop an Astura which he had bought as a saloon in just after the war because he wanted to go racing, and as a result, he took the body off the four-seater and made it into a two-seater racing car with a DB24 Aston body on it, and he then raced it. I bought it from him with my ill-gotten inheritance, and I still have the car, which will, it's astonishing. It's a wonderful car.
I've seen some photos of it. It's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful thing. And am I right in saying that you did actually end up selling it to Eric Clapton for a brief period in the 70s?
Well, this is where the story is a bit of a strange one, because having bought the Steady Special, which I call it now, I decided to go to the south of France for a holiday, and so I needed a spare wheel because I hadn't got one. And Steady said to me, "Don't worry, old boy, we'll go. I know where there's a whole car." And we went round the corner in Weybridge to Oaklands Park, and there in the bushes beside an impressive house was a dilapidated garage, and sticking out through the bonnet of the old car was a tree, and I had photographs of the car, and I bought the car there and then, or Steady bought it because he lent me the 15 quid. So we bought the car for 15 quid, towed it home, and didn't use the wheel because it filled up the whole of the boot. So I went off to the south of France. 2 months later, Steady said to me, "I've got great news for you." I was at the Turin Motor Show, and I saw Battista Pininfarina, and I showed him the picture of your car, and he said to me, "Get Michael to bring the car to me, and I'll rebuild it for you. Right, long story, short story. A year later, we drove to Turin in the car. It had no roof on it. It was a beautiful open four-seater that he had designed when he started on his own against his father. Anyhow, I took the car down there, and a year later, I got a phone call or a telegram, in fact, from the works manager saying, come down and collect the car. It's finished. No cost. And so I got hold of one of my best friends at the time, who happened to have a Type 57 gangloff-bodied Bugatti, and we drove down to Italy in the Bugatti. I've got a photograph of it with the speedo running at 100 miles an hour. We had to camp on the side of the road because we had no money, and we arrived at Pininfarina, and in front of the workshop, he comes out and he looks at the Bugatti and he said, Michael, you are rotten. You have brought the most beautiful car to collect your beautiful car. And it was just astonishing because it was a freebie. Well, who could possibly ever have expected to get a freebie? Anyhow, the long and the short of it was I then had started my insurance broking business, John Scott and Partners, and I used it as the marketing tool for not John Scott and Partners. And because of Steady's connection with the VSCC, I became the official broker for the Vintage Sports Car Club. And as a result, I got to know all the presidents, and that is really how and why I got involved, because I then went racing with the Steady Special, but I had to sell the Pininfarina car because I got divorced, and I sold it to Eric Clapton. So that's that end of that story. But so I did have two cars, two Lanciers. So it gets a bit confusing, but my life's confusing.
and then, of course, you're very well known as the founder of the prestigious 96 Club. How did that all begin, and why is it called the 96 Club?
Right. This is the simpler answer. Steady Barker was a member of the Guild of Motoring Writers, and the Guild of Motoring Writers have had track days for 50 years, 60 years. And I went with him to one of their days, and we went up in his a road test Peugeot 504. Anyhow, I spent some time out on the track with him, and I thought he's completely bonkers. We're going to crash, because I'd never been on a racetrack before. And consequently, that's when my passion for actual racing began, because he was a brilliant driver. And as a result, I got the bug in a big way, and I then went racing. However, I had a problem, because at the same time I started modern engineering, the Ferrari garage, and I happened to sell a friend of mine, Ray Belm, who's quite a well-known racing driver because he raced the Gulf Porsches and also the Gulf McLaren. And I'd sold him two Ferraris, and he promptly lost his license for driving his wife to hospital in one of the Ferraris. And he got done for speeding at 96 miles an hour. So that's why we sick, because 3 weeks later we were playing golf, and he said, Scotty, we've got to start a way of renting racetracks so that we can use our cars when we lost our license. So that's why we started the club. We started it because we wanted somewhere to practice and also to be able to use our cars when we had no license. So that's the answer to that.
Fantastic. And I believe you've introduced a huge number of people over the years to racing on track and driving on track. I believe Eric Clapton, you mentioned, as one person, Nick Mason, Dave Gilmore, and even Rowan Atkinson, who who my father used to race against in the AMOC days with his Aston Martins. Have you got any stories about the '96 Club track days, and what would be your advice to someone thinking about doing one for the first time?
It's a difficult question to answer. I'll try and answer the first bit. I suppose the best story we have is actually a rowing story. We were at Mallory Park, and he was out there in his a Renault club car. And the great thing about the club is that we were used to the Nick Masons and the Chris Rears and Mark Knopfler. So nobody really took any notice of them. But obviously, we were slightly in awe of them all. But Rowan was out in this Renault going very quickly. And suddenly, I don't know whether you've been to Mallory, but it's a big lake in the middle of the track. And anyhow, he lost it right up at the far other side of the lake. And we saw him, horrified, going backwards into the lake. He stopped a foot away from the bank. When he came back into the pits, he got out and Mr. Bean told us the story. It was the funniest display of or description of a car accident I've ever heard. And he did it in the typical Mr. Bean fashion, which you either love him or hate him. I love him. Other stories, Nick Mason and Dave Gilmore arrived back from Italy, having driven their F40s to Silverstone, and they were the first ones to come to the country. And I was standing next to him. He said, "Go on, off you go." And so I get in his F40 and I do 10 laps of Silverstone in this bloody car. I don't know whether you've driven an F40, but they are the most wonderful. They're the most exciting supercar there will ever be, in my opinion.
Sadly not. It's on my bucket list to do one day.
You should do, because it's the most wonderful thing. I had organised a race between the Orient Express, and we drove 12 supercars through the night to the Cipriani in Venice. And I was lucky enough to go in an NF40, and we were stopped for speeding at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning in Austria. And we were doing sort of 130, 140, coming down the mountains. We saw this police vehicle flashing light. They pulled us in, and the guns were out, and they couldn't believe what they saw. And they said, "I think you were speeding. We will have to fine you." And they fined us 6 Austrian shillings and sent us on a change gear in an F40. It sort of goes, pops at you. Very exciting and raw, really raw bit of kit.
Iconic car. Absolutely.
I don't know whether there's any. I don't want to tell. There are other stories, but Nick Mason has been a friend of mine because his father, Bill Mason, made all the Shell films. You'll have seen the Shell films, and he was a friend of Steady's. So Steady obviously introduced me to Bill. I just started my insurance broking business, and so I insured Nick when he was an apprentice. He was an architectural student, and he had no money, but he had this lovely Aston Martin, which we insured for fire and theft. And that was before Nick was what he became and what he is, one of the biggest collectors and one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet.
Fantastic. And what would your advice be to someone thinking about doing a track day for the first time?
Well, it's one of those things that I was a very bad driver, and I was lucky enough to race a lot of interesting cars, and it's not nearly as scary as you imagine, as long as you have an instructor and listen to the instructor. And when we started the 96 Club, we had a bit of a reputation for writing cars off. And so very soon after, we'd had 2 or 3 accidents, although we were very lucky in that in the 50 years that we did car track days, we, touch wood, had no nasties. But I instigated a new rule. You had to have instruction, whoever you were, before you go out on your own. And we had the rule that if whatever circuit you'd been to, if you hadn't had instruction and you were a novice, you must have instruction, because it is very easy to make a fool of yourself, because you can go out for half an hour with an instructor, and then go out on your own, and suddenly you find that you've become Sterling Moss, and you lose it, and it ended in tears. So it's the only way to actually nowadays. I think it's more important than ever, the track day clubs, because it's the only time you can actually get to enjoy and drive a fast car fast. You can't do it anywhere else. So I think it's something that we should be encouraging everybody, because it's the only fun you can have with a car. I don't know whether you agree with me.
No, I definitely agree. And certainly I started my racing, my historic racing, I guess, well, career is probably the wrong word, but my passion for it through doing some track days. It was a great way of getting the confidence to then do my first race. So I completely agree. And particularly these days, it's sort of not so obviously socially acceptable to go do 130. Well, it's pretty difficult to do 130 miles per hour on public roads without getting into some trouble. No, I completely agree. I think track days are a fantastic tool. So and just coming on to the 96 Club, you have 2 of my all-time favourite racing drivers as your patrons in the form of Sir Sterling Moss and Derek Bell. You were obviously incredibly sad about Sterling passing away a few weeks ago, or a month ago now. Please can you tell us a bit about Sir Sterling and how he became a patron of the 96 Club, and maybe give us a few of your thoughts as to why he was such an iconic and loved racing driver, and indeed a true gentleman.
Well, you can imagine. I went to Haileybury. Sterling went to Haileybury. He was 10, 12 years ahead of me. His name was carved on a desk that I sat at, and I was a fan of his from day one. And luckily, through Steady, I met him at a track day, and not a track day, a race day, and I got on very well with him. And the first time I actually got to know him very well was Philip Mann had the 1914 Grand Prix Mercedes winning car, and I'd been taught how to start big old cars on the handle by Steady, and the principle is you put it on compression, and then you look over your shoulder and you confuse the car into thinking that you're not going to do anything to it, and then you swing it and it'll catch fire. It'll catch, it'll start running. And so, because I was the only, before I taught Philip Mann how to start the car, he always used to take 2 people with him wherever he went, so that you could push. And so Mercedes-Benz wanted us to display the car in London. So I was asked if I would do it, because I was the only one who could start it. And I had to drive Sterling, or I didn't drive Sterling. I put Sterling in the car and I was driven by him. And we were in Hyde Park, and we went up the wrong carriageway, and there's no right turn, and Sterling turned right. Well, you can imagine, the policeman said, "Who do you think you are?" Well, it was Sterling Moss. So I knew Sterling pretty well, and became a great friend. And so when I started the 96 Club, I asked him if he'd be one of the patrons, and he said yes. And he turned out for me once or twice a year for the whole time we had the club. And when he died, I wrote to all my members and I said, can you please send in some of your memories of Sterling? And I've had over 50 people write in with little stories about what a gent he was, funny little stories about staying in a hotel during the last Targa Florio when they stayed, the members stayed in the hotel with him. Every story that I've got from or memory of Sterling is what a wonderful guy he was, and what a talented person, and how charming. So that basically, I'm compiling a little tribute to Sterling, and I'm going to publish all these little articles because they're just divine, and he was just a lovely person.
I completely agree. I've been fortunate enough to meet him a couple of times, and I couldn't agree more. Indeed, he actually asked my mother on a date back in the day, which I have to forgive him for. But
Yeah.
I think I think my father wasn't too happy about it, given that they were going out at the time. But there we go. He found he met Susie, and the rest is history.
He was an enthusiast.
And in fact, I was actually in his last historic race he did at Le Mans. And I just happened to be there when he got out of the Porsche. I think it was a 550, which he was racing, which was his car. And he said it's the first time ever in my career that I felt scared in the race car. And that was, he decided that's it. He's retiring, and he never raced after that.
Right.
But yeah, an amazing man, and what an incredible driver as well, and certainly one of my absolute heroes. So brilliant. And so coming back to the 96 club, last year, 2019, marked the 40th anniversary of the club. What is in store for the future of this fantastic club, and how is the club adapting to the current coronavirus lockdown?
It's a bit of an unfair question there, because it's all work in progress. One of the things that I'm very lucky in, that my son has a film catering business, and he's mothballed the whole operation because of the virus, because basically the filmmaking has stopped. And he had 10 days ago a 44-page dossier, because obviously when you're doing the catering for a film, you have got all the stars, you look after all the team, and you've got to keep them safe. And basically, the rules he's making and the structure he's making is going to be priceless from our point of view, because we will be able to put on events with the knowledge that if it's good enough for the film industry, it'll be okay for our club members. So we are cautiously, as you know, we're doing these virtual rendezvous, which you're kindly coming on Sunday. But we hope that by September, we will be in a position to have a proper car show along the lines of the 96 Club rendezvous. And we're planning to do it at Wimbledon, because we've got a lot of space there. Wimbledon is a Capability Brown estate, and we've got enough room for 100 cars, 200 cars. So we're planning to do our first event there. And I suppose what we're thinking is that we've got to wait and see what the rules are, because people want to use their cars. And as you know, London is a nightmare for car ownership, because they just don't want us there, do they? And every time you open the paper, there's another rule and restriction, and there's parking. So consequently, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to dilute our events. So we've got over 150 members, And we have this, I don't think you've been to Chesham Gardens, but we got this place in Chesham Garden, which actually will only hold in future 25 cars. So we're going to have, say, 3 rendezvous a month in the garden, to cater for the members. But we'll also put on bigger events, as we're going to do in Wimbledon in September. So apart from adapting, we don't really, as I say, it's too early, isn't it? I don't know whether you've got thoughts about what you think the future is going to be, but we're nervous about it. And there's this new zone that you can't drive into in London, which is 24 hours a day. No, 18 hours a day and 7 days a week. Well, it's ridiculous, but that's what's happening, isn't it?
Yeah.
What can we do with our cars?
Yeah, certainly from a regulation perspective, I'm not sure, but I think from a passion perspective, I know that all the people I speak to who have classic cars and historic cars during lockdown, they're all desperate to get back out to events and to get back on track. So I think there's a lot of pent up desire to get behind the wheel again as soon as they can and to attend these events. So I'm not worried about the passion being there. The regulations sadly are out of our hands. So we'll see.
Well, we do have our track day on the 10th at Brands Hatch, and we're fully subscribed. So you're absolutely right. People are very keen to get back on the track.
Absolutely. And I'm conscious we're taking up a lot of your time. So to end with, we have a few quick fire questions. So first question is, restored or patina?
What, in my opinion?
In your opinion?
Well, it's patina, really. We've got one of the restorers with the guild members who, at a recent, I'm not going to mention any days, a recent concourse, won best original body, and he'd painted it 2 weeks before. So there are some very, very clever painters who can make cars look old. And in my opinion, if it's possible, never, if you can't not do this. But I love cars which haven't been restored. I've got one of my friends has got a Lusso that's the same paintwork, and it's never been painted, and it's delightful, but it's not a concourse winning car, right? So in my view is I wish my car was paintwork was original, but it's not. But it's history and time doesn't really encourage you to not leave cars as they are. But certainly they are, in my opinion, patina is wonderful.
Yep, I agree. And most unusual car ever to attend the 96 Club meeting?
Most unusual car. Well, we had Agnelli's 212 Ferrari, which was amazing. We've had such a selection of cars. I suppose the trouble is, you see, my car. We've had an HC Alpha, which was Nuvolari's car. It's too difficult because I love cars.
Yeah.
And therefore, is it the most rare car? Is it the most famous car? Or is it just the nicest car to drive? And to be honest, no finer car than an HC Alpha, right? Because it does everything. And the modern version of the HC, in my opinion, is the 250 short wheelbase Ferrari. I've been very lucky because I've driven so many amazing cars. I drove. For 2 years, I had Nick Mason's GTO in my garage because he was in he was in the south of France on a tax exile. So I looked after the car, and I suppose it wasn't very expensive in those days. It was only 50,000 quid, right, instead of 72 million. And I actually left it on the side of the road because I ran out of petrol on the way to work. And I collected it 2 hours later. I got married in it. I got married in it, and I was driving back from the registry office, and I went across the Hog's Back, and my new wife said, "I never want to go in this damn car again." and, I said, "Oh, well, I'm sorry about that. Well, the marriage didn't last."
Dear.
But so I suppose GTO is iconically probably the most sensational, valuable car ever. Right. So that's probably my favorite car.
Yep, that makes sense. And then another sort of question might be answered. Favorite circuit?
Well, I suppose it can only be Spa. Spa is, I don't know whether you've driven Spa, but it's the most amazing circuit. It's got everything, in my opinion. You've got to have seriously big, you've got to have seriously strong resolution to drive that circuit really fast. And Eau Rouge is. Have you driven Spa?
I haven't raced it. I've driven around it. Never raced.
Well, Eau Rouge is just the most mind-blowingly exciting experience you can have. So Spa is my favourite circuit.
Amazingly, you're the fourth person we've interviewed that said exactly the same thing. So we had Lord Hesketh. He said again his favourite circuit. Gillian Goldsmith or Fortescue Thomas again her favourite circuit. And actually last week we spoke to Rob Hubbard, Bonhams, head of MPH Bonhams, again Spa. So it's everyone seems to love Spa, which is, and I completely agree as well. I think it's not only from a driver perspective, from a spectator perspective as well. You get to see some fantastic corners. You can see long sections of the track given the undulations of the circuit, which at a lot of other flatter circuits you can't see.
It's still as it was. It's unspoiled. When they put the chicanes into Le Mans on the Le Mans Straight, they destroyed the whole thing. Spa is almost identical to what it was. It's always been, except it's not the long circuit. I've never raced on the long circuit, but the long circuit was a seriously important bit of racing. But you couldn't improve on that. Basically, they've cut it down from I think about 2 miles, haven't they? But so what it was like originally, God only knows. Heaven, wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. And last question, and this might be a tricky one given your last answer: British or Italian cars?
Wow, it's no contest, is there really? Italian. I've had over 30 Lancias. I've had 5 Ferraris. I started a business because I bought a Ferrari, a California Spider, for £1,900 in Malta, and the guy who found it for me blew the engine up on the way to the docks, and I started a business to rebuild it. So the modern engineering story that is a nightmare, but it's also wonderful because it enabled me to enjoy Ferraris, and I love them. But my favourite car is a Lancia.
Yep. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. There's some great stories there, and what a fascinating automotive life you've led and indeed continue to lead. So we really thank you for your time, and we look forward to speaking to you and your members at the virtual rendezvous on Sunday.
Very good. Well, thank you very much.